Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here, coming at you with another video. This one on critical realism. And I know I use that phrase a lot, and I just wanted to describe for people what it roughly approximates or is. There are a lot of positions out there, epistemologies out there that would call themselves critical realist epistemologies. And I found this helpful taxonomy, if you will, in Jesse Gentile's unpublished dissertation called Bridge Building and Theological Method. It is really, really good, and I hope it gets published soon so that you guys can get a little bit of insight into this. I especially like the sections on critical realism. The sections on analytic theology, I'm not 100% convinced on yet, but it's still really good. But he has in one of the chapters kind of a tenfold way of defining critical realism and talking about it. And so I just want to walk through each of those and how I understand it and discern it. This is not meant to be a definitional video. It's meant to help you approximate what critical realism is all about. So if you're really unsure where I'm coming from when I use that term, after this video, hopefully you'll have a lot better sense of what I'm talking about when I say I'm a critical realist or critical realism is the position that I hold. I'm probably going to keep this as a small notepad doc just because I don't want this to be something that is, massive white in your face, right? So I'm just going to keep this as is, and let's walk through each of these. So the first position is reality exists mind independently. This is the realist portion of critical realism. This is different than, say, idealism, where everything is in the mind of God or something like that, and a strict materialism, which says, there is essentially physical things only out there. Well, really, it is in alignment with that latter portion because that's still a realist way of looking at the world. If you were to ask the age old question, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? The critical realist would answer yes, because reality exists mind independently. It's independent of me. We have to go out there and examine reality for ourselves. The second position is that reality or segments of it can be known. So this is contra relativism. A lot of people will essentially say that we can't know reality if it's real out there. And they basically say that ontologically speaking, there's no way to get at the real. And so because of that, we're just rational or not rationalists, we're relativists. We just believe that truth is relative to the individual. Whatever's true for you is true for you, and whatever's true for me is true for me. It's really helpful that this is in here because a lot of critical realists get attacked over the fact that they're being more relativistic in terms of their epistemology. But that's not speaking about reality itself. We're not making a claim about what exists out there in the world. Instead, we're just talking about how much access do we have to that reality. Because after all, reality is always mediated to us through our own senses, be that physical, right? Our eyes, our ears, our nose, etc. We have reality mediated to us through our senses or our minds. We are reading or something like that. We're trying to understand and interpret the ideas. That reality is mediated to us through our minds. So reality is there, it's real, but my ability to purchase that reality or grasp it is mediated to me by the fact that I'm a finite human being. And so because of that, I recognize that my grasp of that reality is not naively a one to one correspondence or relationship, that if I deem something to be real because I've perceived it, that it must be. No, I recognize that reality is mediated to me through my own senses, right? Now, C, we can refer adequately to reality through semantic vehicles. What I take this to mean is that we're not playing language games when we talk about truth or reality or things like that. A lot of branches of philosophy have essentially said that religion is kind of meaningless because it's just language games. You're talking about things that you can't actually have adequate purchase on. And so that's what this statement is saying. No, we do believe we can express, feel out towards, grope towards the real as we're trying to explain it or describe it. We may not be able to describe it 100% perfectly with no flaws or issues whatsoever, but at the end of the day, we are able to explain or describe some of it. We can refer to it through semantic vehicles, the words, the phrases, the ideas that we construct. Number 4, we interact with reality in a mediated and not direct way. And I already talked about this. Reality is mediated to me through my senses. This is because I am a finite creature. I cannot have unmediated direct purchase or access to the real. Instead, it is mediated to me. And again, this is a finite creature thing. At first, when I was developing this idea, I thought that this might be a product of the fall. And that if we weren't fallen human beings, then we wouldn't have a problem. But that's not true. If you think of Adam and Eve in the garden and what they're perceiving on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that fruit is being perceived by them differently because they are independent, finite human beings, even though they're unfallen. So they're both looking at the apple or whatever it is and saying, okay, this is what it looks like to me. And to Eve, this is what it looks like to me. They are interacting with reality in a mediated and non-direct way. And this is not a product of the fall. This is a product of the fact that we're finite creatures. So finite creatures must interact with reality in a mediated and non-direct way. Number 5, resulting knowledge of reality is fallible and provisional. This is a consequence of number 4. If reality is mediated to you through your senses, or reality as you're reading about it is mediated to you through your mind, the knowledge of said reality must be fallible and provisional. This is where I've talked about before, not having premature epistemic closure. I can say I know something, but it doesn't necessarily mean I know it with 100% certainty. I can't. Knowledge of reality is fallible and provisional because I'm a finite creature. It just is the way it is. This is how God made the world. Saying something doesn't make it so. You can't say that this is not the case and magically hope that that is how the world works. It's not. This is how the world works. To me, my take, my perspective is that all critical realism is trying to do is take the world as it's given to us. All it's saying is, let's look at the reality that we live in and try to understand what is going on. What is the situation we find ourselves in? That's the world we've got. This is the world God put us in. It is just a fundamental recognition of here we are. And this is reality as it's given to us. We can wish it were different, but it's not. So we got to work with what we've got. Okay. And so knowledge is fallible and provisional. This is all knowledge. All knowledge is fallible and provisional. You don't close the door on knowledge claims prematurely because, after all, additional evidence, additional data points might piece the puzzle together differently for us. We might be able to form a better pattern based upon that additional evidence. This is confidence, not certainty, right? That's why this is so important. So knowledge is fallible and provisional. And again, I've made the case before that this is much more in alignment with faith. When God's people are walking with him down through history and interacting with him and trying to make sense of divine manifestations and letters written from prophets, etc., when they're trying to make sense of all of that, they are understanding knowledge in the way that I'm describing here. This is how human beings have always tried to understand knowledge. Again, it's only a result of foundationalism, Cartesian Enlightenment perspective that thinks, I think, therefore I am. All of a sudden, I can have this certain knowledge through deductive process. That is left hemispheric usurpation. That is the master and his emissary all over again. That's not how it works. Deduction serves a support role. It is not how we can formulate our entire theory of knowledge. So resulting knowledge is fallible and provisional. Number 6, semantic reference is never exhaustive when describing reality. And what he means by semantic reference is the words we're putting together, et cetera. Back to number 3, the semantic vehicles we use, how we're trying to describe things. It's never exhaustive when describing reality. And so this is true of our doctrines, our theology, et cetera. We are using the best language we can to try and make sense of all of the data points. A lot of data points for Christians, for example, are Bible verses, church tradition, history, et cetera. You've got all these data points out there, and you're like, okay, if I take these data points and these ones and these ones and these ones, I roughly arrive at the doctrine of the Trinity. And so then you describe it, and you say, God is, within the one being of God, there are 3 divine persons, namely Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That is your semantic reference to God. But it's never exhaustive. You can't say, all right, we've got it all figured out, because knowledge is fallible and provisional. So you say, that's our best guess for right now, based upon all the data points we have, as to we think this is the most likely theological conclusion or doctrine. But at the end of the day, I'm not exhaustive when I describe reality. So we recognize that my theological or doctrinal position is still open to discussion and debate, right? All right. Let's see which one. Maybe I got the. This is 7. Portray critical realism as a middle road between epistemic extremes. And the reason this one is written differently is Jesse Gentile does a really cool thing in his dissertation where he takes some almost definitional aspects of critical realism, the first handful are that way, and he says this is how other authors often define it. But then he also does a kind of inductive method, which is cool because it's the abductive inference circle, where he essentially grabs the latter half and he says, if I look at common traits or characteristics among critical realists, this is some of what I'm seeing, right? So he does a really cool thing uniting the two. And this one is where it starts to be worded a little bit differently, and it's heading that direction. Portray critical realism as a middle route between epistemic extremes. Now, what does he mean by this? Oftentimes, and Esther Meek does this in her Longing to Know book, oftentimes it's portrayed that there are only two positions you can hold. You can either be a relativist, i.e., what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. There is no absolute truth. Or you can essentially be a foundationalist, right? That there's 100% truth out there, absolute truth, objective truth, and we can know it. And what critical realism frames itself up as is the midpoint between those two, right? The via media between relativism and foundationalism. It's my contention that a lot of people, when they're leaving the faith, when they're deconstructing, they are not deconstructing from Christianity. They're deconstructing from foundationalism. They recognize that foundationalism is broken and it doesn't work. But because they view Christianity as unified and melded inevitably to foundationalism, they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And they say, I'm going to abandon foundationalism. I'm going to abandon Christianity because I'm abandoning foundationalism. They don't see that it's knit together that way, but it is that way. And what critical realism says is you are correct that foundationalism has problems, but it doesn't mean that reality itself is relativistic. And we all know that, we all live that way, etc. So between the Scylla and Charybdis is where critical realism lies. It says reality is true, it's objective, and it's independent of myself. However, my ability to access said reality is fallible and provisional because it is mediated to me through my senses and my mind. That's just the world we live in, y'all. That is what it is like to be a human being, okay? We are finite creatures. So that's why the critical realists portray themselves that way. Number 8, reality is stratified, provoking a stratified epistemology and stratified semantics. This one's complicated, and it's not necessarily, it's not needed to understand everything, but I will describe it in brief. Roy Bhaskar talked about reality being stratified, and what he essentially meant, he talked about 3 layers, that reality has layers to it. He talked about the empirical, which are the empirical things that I'm experiencing now, the facts or the data points before me at the moment. Then he talked about the actual. Those are all possible things that people could experience or data points out there that are available everywhere. But then he talked about the real. And the real is interesting because the real are mechanisms that operate behind the scenes. These are the sorts of things that are unseen and you can't observe them directly, but they're real and they exist. Okay, gravity might be a good example of this. It's real, it exists, it's in operation, and we can measure it, but notice that you are doing so like indirectly. You're indirectly trying to measure gravity and understand it. But you can't observe it directly. You observe its effects, okay? That's the realm of the real. And for Bhaskar, the real is where a lot of stuff happens and we can't observe it directly. And this is part of what leads us to a greater amount of humility, recognizing that the world is an open system. And as we try to understand and interact in the world with the things that are going on, we are often not able to perfectly make sense of all of it. That's okay. It's just the world we live in. You can't just say, no, the world is a closed system and try to close it. Don't get me wrong. I understand your science experiments will go better if you close the system, but the fact of the matter is we live in a world that is very much an open system with all sorts of influences and mechanisms and things happening in the open system that are affecting it. Okay. It's just the way things are. So reality is stratified, and there is a realm of the real where mechanisms and processes are operating that are not directly accessible by us. We have to access them indirectly. That's where abductive inference comes into play. Abductive inference is the method of hypothesization, where we essentially say, maybe the world is like this. I'm observing a bunch of things. Maybe the world is like this. And then we test and check that. And that leads to the ninth one. Ontology should guide epistemology. Thus, they reject a priori one-size-fits-all epistemologies. There's kind of two, in my mind, two claims being made here, and so I want to talk about each of them. Ontology should guide epistemology. This goes back to what I said earlier about the objective reality, but also that knowledge comes to me mediated through my senses and through my mind. There's a priority to those, and the priority is on the ontology. If you prioritize the epistemology and say everything is mediated to me through my mind, you might end up in full-blown relativism, where you just believe truth is relative as well. What this point says is ontology guides epistemology. That is, the real is the first and foremost truth. Ergo, we have to adopt an epistemic approach that takes the world as it is, not the other way around. We don't get to define things into existence and say, this is how it works. Instead, we have to respond to ontology, the way the world actually is. So ontologically, if the world is in a certain way, that should guide my epistemic approach. And this goes back to confidence, not certainty, and it goes back to the realm of the real with stratified ontology. Because if there are unseen mechanisms operating out there in the world, then I need to do my epistemic work with that being a reality. Understanding that I can't directly observe gravity, I'm going to have to use indirect means to try to come to conclusions. And again, that's the process of hypothesization. So ontology should guide epistemology. That's fundamental, and that's how we avoid full-blown relativism. But then also, thus they reject a priori one-size-fits-all epistemologies. This one's really important to me. I struggle with a priori knowledge. This is a book I was reading on the topic, trying to get a sense of a priori knowledge and what positions there are. I'm still in process. I'm still learning, so I'm not going to sit here and say there is no such thing as a priori knowledge. But to me, knowledge, the vast majority of the time, is a posteriori. We are observing individual things, and then we posit hypotheses. We try to make sense of the individual observations we are making, and we posit a law or a rule that we can then deductively argue from. But we should never lose sight of the fact that we're positing a hypothesis. And this is where I think oftentimes many deductive approaches go wrong, because they think mind independently that they can come to some sort of hypothesis and argue deductively with certainty down to certain conclusions. And I just don't think that's possible. And so I'm a little skeptical of a priori knowledge. And oftentimes when something comes to me as an a priori claim, I wonder what data points existed ahead of time for somebody to posit that hypothesis. Why are you coming up with this a priori claim? It's because of certain previous a posteriori knowledge that's driving you to that point. Again, I'm not 1,000,000% dogmatic on this, and I'm still learning on that. But I'll tell you, when I read analytic philosophers and people who get very deductive and who rely heavily on a priori knowledge, there's a part of me that just, it kind of reacts strongly against it and is like, wait a second here. We're assuming more than we can know, right? And again, that's my critical realist bias in this whole thing. And finally, number 10, models are semantic tools for referring adequately to mind-independent reality that is never exhaustively known. I think that's really helpful. Models are semantic tools for referring adequately to mind-independent reality that is never exhaustively known. Let's go back to the Trinity. I can never know God exhaustively. Many Christians would say that. But I am utilizing models as semantic tools. But it's really helpful to say this, I'm trying to describe what the real is like. I can never be 100% certain that I know, but this is my best guess given all of the data points and information that is available to me. Okay. And so we put out a model, and we're willing to revise our model provided we get more data, more information, and we have to make a change or different decisions. But for now, this model is our best approach to what's going on. That mind independent reality that can never be exhaustively known. All right. So I hope that was helpful for you. Critical realism, as you can see, is not just this simple, straightforward, no controversy, no issues. Just read this quick definition. There's a lot that goes into critical realism, and it can be a difficult field to navigate, which is part of why my channel exists. I want to help people understand these ideas because my basic contention is that Protestants, Western Christians in general, have been tied to foundationalism for so long that when relativism has come along and questioned certain things, many people have just thrown the baby out with the bathwater. There's no need, no reason to abandon Christianity just because you're opposed to foundationalism. And relativism is not the only option out there. Critical realism offers a genuine via media between foundationalism that is sick and has made the West left hemispheric obsessed, and relativism, which abandons truth or reality as it's given to us by God. So hopefully this video was helpful to you to kind of orient yourself. If you would like more videos or you would like me to expand on a certain idea or concept on how I view it, please just put that down in the comments below. We'll catch you all again real soon. Take care. God bless.